about what our paint is, what are the three things that make our paint again? Vehicle.
Body.
Almost.
Pigment.
What's that?
Pigment.
Pigment. Vehicle, pigment, and starts with B. Binder. So with oil paint, our pigment, our physical pigments, our binder is something called linseed oil. So it's oil. It's actually attaching it to the surface. And our vehicle is actually like our solvent. So our Gamsol. In every tube of oil paint, there's those three things. There's a solvent, there's oil, and there's pigment. So generally, whenever y'all are working with oils, and you're working on an oil painting for longer than one sitting, it's important to think about this idea of fat over lean, which means that you need to paint with your thinnest layers first and allow your paint to get thicker and thicker over the course of your painting. So for my underpainting, I'm going to be diluting my paint quite a bit. So this is what we've done in most of our underpaintings up until this point. We've just added a little bit of extra Gamsol, and we're making a combination that is breaking down the binder a little bit. We're using a lot more of our vehicle, and that's making this really, it's kind of like a wash of oil paint. So in this more reductive technique, I'm gonna have y'all, after you've gotten your image onto your page, so I ended up using a grid method, which you're more than welcome to use if you'd like. Just make sure that you're translating them from a format or like a ratio that lines up, or else you'll just be warping the image. So if I tried to translate this onto a square by dividing it all into fourths, or into fourths like this, it would totally warp my image in a way that I don't necessarily want. I want to really just be able to translate it over directly. So I found by doing some math that I had to tape off my edges so that I could kind of, because this image is longer than my rectangle. So I had to tape it off, so I'm only kind of working with it here. And then I did my measurements. And I first just split things in half. The best way to do math when you aren't great at math is to split things in half. And then I split the half in half. Do that line, make sure your lines are straight and perpendicular to the edge, or else you'll end up with some wonky grids. Then from the grid, I use a colored pencil to just translate the shapes that I saw and translate my contour lines. So it's not perfect. You'll see I drew some lines, then I moved them over. If you start with a thinner line with your colored pencil, then you can really kind of, once you figure out exactly where that line needs to be, you can make that line the darkest. So start out really thin with your drawing. And then I wasn't quite sure how this would react because I haven't done this in a while. So I put a little bit of gloss medium over most of this, just to let my drawing stick to the surface. But I didn't put gloss medium here, so we'll see what happens. I don't know how it's gonna react. So I've got my mixture here, which is, relatively oily. It's or relatively solventy. So I broke down a lot of my binder and my oil and my pigment to make a super transparent, really kind of unstable mixture, which I'm then going to coat over the entire piece. And because you've already got your drawing in there, it should be helpful, but this is gonna be a way of just sort of toning your whole page, kind of like how you might have done with your acrylic pieces, but it's also gonna allow you to then pull out your values reductively from here. So, and in hindsight, it probably would have been better to use a color of my wash that's different from the color of my drawing. This can be kind of hard for me to make out exactly where things are. Maybe I'll put a little bit of extra Indian yellow in there. I did some more paint anyway. I'll make it kind of like a gradient. So y'all are welcome to use a grid, but you do not have to use a grid. So it's totally optional. And I find that it's a really helpful tool to learn. So if you've never made a painting or a drawing using a grid before, I recommend using this as an opportunity to learn it. I like that color a lot better. But you do not have to use a grid. So you're, at this point, y'all have some solid underpainting skills and drawing skills. So you're going to need a decent amount of paint for this first step. And it's kind of helpful if your tone that you're using is decently dark, so that you can then pull out the highlights. So if your color that you're toning your page with is too light, it's going to be pretty difficult for you to pull highlights out from it and go ahead and start to set up your kind of your values. So again, it's important that because we'll be working on these oil paintings for longer than a day and longer than one sitting, so we're not doing these alla prima, we're doing these over the course of a few weeks. It's important that because there's going to be drying time in between each layer, it's important that we're building our thicker paint slowly up on top of our thinner paint. Anyone have any ideas of like why that is? I don't really know either. But one thing I do know is that when you paint alla prima, or when you paint all in one sitting, it's all one like paint skin. So it's all drying at the same time. Everything is like, all of those particles are like binding together, and it's all drying at the same time. And because oil paint takes much longer to dry, and the thicker the oil paint, the longer it takes for it to dry. If you have different drying time, different layers drying at different times, that can create cracking. So if you have like really thick paint and then you paint really thin paint on top of it, the top layer is going to dry before the layer underneath it dries, which can then create cracking in your paint as it slowly dries. And sort of as your solvent is evaporating off of your surface. So I just toned the whole page with a nice big brush. If you're using a small brush to do this, you'll probably be kicking yourself. So use a nice big brush. And traditionally, a lot of times this was done with like a burnt sienna, so like a really rich earth tone that then you could kind of like pull out the light from. I'm choosing green because my image has a lot of pink and reds and oranges in it, so I think it would be really nice if I had like a complement underneath it. So at this point, I'm going to take a rag and I'm going to start just pulling out the value. So I can use my rag, and if you have gloves, that's awesome. But if you don't have gloves, I recommend just kind of like doubling down your rag a little bit. And then I'm basically using a rag and a finger as my tool to reductively pull away the light out of the image. So overall, this is like a relatively dark image here. So I can start, and let's see, yeah, I'm kind of kicking myself that my drawing is the exact same color as my underpainting. And that's okay. So keep that in mind. Don't do what I did. But I can still kind of see where things are. So I can really kind of like work the image, general to specific, to pull out the big shapes of light as I'm seeing them. And then I can work additively as well. So I can go back and forth between pulling away the light and then adding some more darkness. And And it's important when you're in this underpainting stage that you're really looking at your image or your subject. So I know that some of y'all might be kind of working partially from like sketches as well. I really encourage you to have your image, at least for this first step of the process, as you're really figuring out where things work with light, to really be working from your image. And so this is just gonna help me set up my value scale. So what are my lightest lights, what are my darkest darks? And first I'm just kind of moving throughout the entire space, trying to work the whole image as well. I can make really big marks by like using the side of my finger this way. And you can always go back in with your paint if you move something or put something in the wrong place. So, let's see. And your subjects are probably going to be pretty complex. So I don't expect y'all to move to the next stage today. So I encourage you to use today as just a day for your underpainting. So just a day to tease out where all the light and dark stuff is in your composition, where all of that sits. So I will continue to kind of like pull out some little details. I can really create a beautiful kind of quality of light through the way that I am pulling away at the light that I'm seeing. I can also just sort of block out generally what's happening with the background. So it's a little bit lighter in the foreground, and then it slowly gets darker. I can start to sort of pull some of that out as well. And I really encourage you to work the whole image. Don't get too specific too fast, because this process is all about figuring out how is your painting going to look from 40 feet away? How are those shapes relating to each other? How's your composition functioning? And most importantly, how are you interpreting the light that you're seeing, the values? So kind of like how we did like our monochromatic value painting and then we glazed on top. This is going to be kind of similar, but we're going to be working in really slow layers, and we're going to be letting our paint get thicker instead as we kind of work our way over top. So your drawing and underpainting are probably going to be totally covered in paint by the end of your paintings. You'll be working on these for weeks, and each week you're probably going to be doing a little bit of transparent glazing, a little bit of opaque painting, and then your final layer might be really thick oil paint that'll really sit on the surface. And this is how a lot of like Italian masters would make paintings in a way that created the sense of like transparency on skin. So like the idea of like light glowing on skin, but also they would sometimes use like a green underpainting and then kind of build warmer tones on top of the green in order to kind of create the illusion of that there's like blue blood in our veins underneath our skin. So you can really think about it like you're kind of building the color from the inside out. But keep in mind that this stage of the process is all about just setting up yourself with a nice roadmap. And I encourage you to work general to specific. But by the end of class today, ideally you'll have a pretty specific underpainting where you'll feel really confident with how your drawing is working and sort of how you'll then build color on top of it. So I'm going to be painting this in full color, even though this is like a very green underpainting. And you can get really detailed even with this reductive process. But then I can also mix up more of my dark paint, and then I can have a session with this where I'm just going through and I'm just popping in like the darkest darks. So for me, I went through and was just thinking, what are my light tones and my lightest lights, pulling them out reductively, and then I might go in with my darkest darks. You're welcome to use like a neutral tone for your underpainting, but you can also use like a really vibrant tone if you'd like. This paint will be dry probably in like a day because you're using so much solvent. So because this is very diluted, it's not going to take long to dry at all, even though I covered almost the whole thing with paint. So fat over lean, thinking about thin layers of paint for the first few layers, and then we're going to get thick later on. So everything you paint today is going to be pretty thin, and then you're going to be even like pulling away a lot of that paint as well, so it'll just get even thinner through this process of your underpainting. Anyone have any questions? Or just questions about like the project in general? Okay, thanks, Jane. And I'm going to come around and chat with y'all about your ideas.